for coming. The title of today's event is Iranian Civil Society, Past, Present, and Future. I'm Karim Sajidpour of the Carnegie Endowment. I think given the results of the Republican primary, discussion about American civil society may have been more apt today, but I'm really thrilled to have such a tremendous panel. You have their brief bios, but let me introduce them one by one. I'll start with my far left, Masih Ali-Nejad, who I would argue is Iran's most dynamic, perhaps most important women's rights activist at the moment. She has her own program on Voice of America, and she's really a social media phenomenon. She has almost 1 million followers on Facebook. Her page, My Stealthy Freedom, which I'll ask her to talk about a little bit more. She's based in Brooklyn. To my left is Nina Ansari, who's written a beautiful book, which she's going to be selling and maybe signing afterwards, called Jewels of Allah, which was based on her PhD dissertation at Columbia. And Nina and Masih were both born in Iran, but come from very different backgrounds and have very different perspectives. Masih comes from a village in northern Iran with a population of about, 600 people?
Yeah, almost.
Almost 600 people. And, very traditional family. And Nina's background is much different. Comes from was born in Tehran. Her father was very prominent and esteemed minister during the time of the Shah. He was actually, at one point, Iran's ambassador to the United States. And still very active. And so they have very kind of different perspectives, although they've arrived in similar places, different backgrounds, but arrived in similar places. And last but certainly not least is my friend Laura Sikur to my right. We met in 2005, if you remember, at the home of Siamak Namazi, a close friend of ours who's now been in jail for about 7 months in Iran. And I believe that was your first visit in Iran. To Iran, and it's remarkable that a decade later she has written, in my opinion, perhaps the most beautiful narrative book on Iran's contemporary history, called Children of Paradise. And Laura hopefully will be signing some books for all of you as well. I don't know how you sign things on the Kindle. I read now electronically, but I highly recommend both books. And maybe a good place to start, something I'm very curious about, especially Laura, having just finished your book, is about the state of Iranian civil society, and in particular Iran's intellectual classes, because you profiled young men, women who in the 1970s were inspired by people like Ali Shariati, who kind of fused leftism and Islamism, or people who were inspired by Ayatollah Khomeini, and then in the 80s inspired by Islamic thinkers like Abdul Karim Soroush. And I'm curious, you profiled a lot of kind of contemporary writers and thinkers and civil society activists. I'm curious, who are the new sources of emulation and intellectual inspiration for the younger generation of Iranian civil society? And also, if you can talk about kind of the evolution in thinking of those who were young in the 70s and how they think about Shariati and Soroush and Khomeini now.
That's a big question. One of the major projects of my book was to trace this sort of train of thought from the time of the revolution up through the reform movement that came into being. Really, we think of it as the late 90s and through the Khatami presidency up until the time of Ahmadinejad. And what's been sort of curious about this project is that I started visiting Iran, I think it was actually 2004 when I met you there, really at the end of that reform period. So by the time I started going to Iran, this history was already behind us to some degree. And I was curious about it precisely for that reason, because the young people that I met in those years under Ahmadinejad had already, to some degree, passed beyond the sort of religious intellectuals of the 90s. And there was already a sense that for people who were reform-minded, or who had taken up the call to build Iran's civil society, although the intellectuals of the reform period were hugely important in terms of bridging that distance between the revolution and modern life, Not that the revolution wasn't modern, but that's another question. But even so, these young people were looking elsewhere and looking for other figures to read and to emulate. So honestly, I can't speak with confidence about who it is that students today in Tehran are reading, because I haven't been able to speak with them. I haven't been back for a few years, and when I was going in the later years, it was under increasingly restricted circumstances. But it seemed to me that the trajectory was in an increasingly more secular direction. And the religious intellectuals of the 90s came out of the revolutionary movement and had much more.
There's a conventional wisdom which says that in the 70s, the Iranian civil society and Iranian revolutionaries were very utopianists. You describe them as utopianists in your book, and that today people are much more pragmatic. One of the things I say is that in 1979, Iranians had a revolution without democracy, and today they want a democracy without a revolution. Do you think that conventional wisdom is an accurate assessment?
Yes and no. I think the reform movement, which it came out of the revolutionary strain, but it built in some influences from both from inside Iran and from the West, and it looked to even democratic theory and all kinds of unlikely liberal sources. That movement was, in a sense, utopian, just not in the same way that the revolution was utopian. There were people, when you look at the writings of some of the key reformist thinkers, they were visionary in a way. They were looking at building democratic institutions almost from the ground up, and it's not a small project that they had in mind. Some of them, the one thing that gets short shrift and that I tried to spend a little time on in my book was the city councils project. In 1999, the reformist government held the first ever elections to city council in city and provincial councils in Iran. This was a provision that had been on the books under the Shah. It was on the books under the Islamic Republic, but no one had ever pursued it. The idea was not just that we're going to elect some city council people, but we're going to create a whole political class that didn't exist before, bring 100,000 new people into the political process, and not just that, but provide pressure points where people locally can organize around their interests and their affinities and start to pressure their local council people to be heard, and this will in turn build political parties. Well, this all went in a very unexpected direction, because in the end, you could really say that the political machine that was built in the City Council of Tehran wound up being the machine of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. The reformists didn't wind up becoming the beneficiaries of what they had built there. But it was not, but it was, in a sense, a utopian project, but it was a utopian project in a kind of homely way from our point of view here. There was a sense of, these are mechanisms of democracy that don't sound like, they don't sound visionary in the way that the rhetoric of the revolutionaries sounded visionary, but they were visionary in another sense. They were looking toward a very major long-term change in the relationship between society and the state. Now, after Khatami left office, you could say that the people behind that vision have had to recalibrate their expectations. And I think now one hears a lot about pragmatism, and that represents maybe a chastening of some hopes, or maybe a substantially less utopian, less revolutionary mindset.
Nina, one of the great things you do in your book is talk about the paradox of the Islamic Revolution, and that women's rights were curtailed precipitously as a result of the revolution. Someone like Shirin Ebadi, who was a judge pre-revolution, became secretary immediately after the revolution. But at the same time, unwittingly, the revolution kind of empowered traditional classes and traditional women by allowing them to go to school. Before the revolution, when schools weren't segregated, some traditional families didn't want their daughters to study with boys. And after the revolution, that changed. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about the Iranian women's rights movement today as opposed to the 70s. My obsession is that it was a much more elitist movement in the 70s as compared to now. But is that accurate?
That's true. During the Pahlavi era, specifically the 70s, not by textbook definition a movement because it was dictated from the top down. So when you have a women's rights itinerary, but you're not allowing everyone to have a voice per se, that is not typically what constitutes a movement. What is remarkable about another, like you mentioned, the paradox of this patriarchal climate has been the fact that some of the initial, what seems to the Western, to the outsider, discriminatory and oppressive, some of the initial impositions, namely the veil in single-sex schools, ended up empowering a traditional segment that was really in seclusion during the Pahlavi era, which really had embarked on an overnight trend towards a westernized society, which back then many women were uneducated, many traditional verse towards this trend. Actually, a renowned sociologist and historian, Asif Bayat, I don't know if you're familiar with him, has said that the Islamic Revolution came about not because of a strong Islamic movement, but because of the absence of one. Shireen Abadi talks about in her memoir, Iran Awakening, how despite the fact that she was one of the first women in Iran to become a judge, how she was lured to support Khomeini initially, that Khomeini's rhetoric of a return to cultural authenticity, of which Shiite Islam was a part of, appealed to her and the masses. It resonated in a way that the Shah's overnight Western trend didn't. And she mentioned something fascinating in her book. She said, it took scarcely 10 minutes after Khomeini landed in Iran, in Tehran, that I realized that I had enthusiastically participated in my own demise. So I think that's powerful. One, because we tend to, and I'm guilty of that. For years, the only narrative that I had about Iran was from mainstream media and family and friends, and I'm guilty of what Mrs. Abadi did, which is we tend to not look beneath the surface and not dissect the layers, especially with a country like Iran, and I'd like to preface this in everything I say. Iran has an exceptionally convoluted historical, political, and social landscape. And when you hear Khomeini's rhetoric, his interviews given when he was in exile, specifically in France, especially about women, it's very vague. So you cannot fault women like Mrs. Abadi, who were highly educated, for supporting someone who was really preaching, speaks to his knowledge of where there was a deficiency within the Iranian population at large. So, but if you go back in history, Khomeini had written a manifesto on the conduct of the devout called the Clarification of Questions. In that, he enumerates all the his subordinate stance regarding women. So, if you go back in history, the rhetoric was already embedded. It's just when he wanted to amass support, he omitted all of that.
He was a clever politician.
Yeah.
So there's a wonderful quote I like from Abbas Milani at Stanford University, who says that in the age of the internet and social media, diaspora communities become part of the civil society of their native countries. And both you and Masi are so active on social media. First, I'll start with you, Nina. I'm just curious what you've talked a little bit about the interactions you've had, despite having not actually visited Iran for 3 decades, but the Iranian women who reach out to you from throughout the country and questions they have for you.
As someone who, I always say I'm from the typewriter generation, so as someone who didn't even have a Facebook friend page, which I always say is from my daughter's generation, for me, and Laura and I were talking earlier about this, I was extremely anti-social media because I've been very private, and for 10 years I was literally in the archives researching on my own, so to put myself out there was just daunting. But I was told I cannot, and Masi would attest to that, you cannot spread the word you're doing. You cannot make any kind of an impact if you don't put yourself on social media. which for me was one step at a time. But fast forward 3 years, I see the benefits in my work, namely that, yes, Twitter and Facebook are blocked, but this generation in Iran is very savvy. They have proxy servers that bypass the blockages. Instagram is not blocked. And the communication that I have literally on a daily basis, specifically on Twitter and Instagram, with people from Iran, especially young girls in Iran, is really the best part of my day. I get a lot of feedback. I get a lot of young women sending me clippings of accomplishments that Iranian women have had in small villages that I really, in the beginning, was saying to them, don't send me this, because I was afraid they'd get in trouble. But there's such a fearless generation, and their answer is categorically, we don't care. They really want, this regime has really tried to close all the doors, and they really, really want to reach out and come out of isolation. So that's the beauty of social media.
Yeah, and it's a good segue to Masih. Masih's page, Sheryl Sandberg from Facebook said that Masih's page was her favorite Facebook page, My Stealthy Freedoms, and just, is it 2 years now?
Yesterday was, second anniversary.
1 million followers in less than 2 years, which is just unbelievable. And she posts these photos and videos and gets tens of thousands of comments and likes and things like that. So just in the event that not everyone in the room is familiar with it, can you talk about where that project came from, how you thought of it, and where it's at now?
Sure, just to make it clear, it's Sheryl Sandberg's favorite page, and for sure, it's the most hated page for the government of Iran.
Yeah.
I was listening to what Laura and Nina are saying about the revolution, and I was a little bit embarrassed, because for me, I grew up in a small village, and my parents were involved in the revolution. And I am the child of revolution. But now, when you go to any Iranian parents and you ask them whether they are responsible about what we are suffering now after the revolution, you won't find any of them saying that, yes, we were supporting the revolution. But my parents, and I know a lot of people from my village, they were supporting the revolution. I was only 2 years old. And that's true what Nina said. It just opened the door towards my family to go to schools and university. And I think they regret now. Because I was educated after the revolution, and all I learned, I just put it back. And I started to realize that all we're learning about history, it's wrong. It's a big lie. And some people now, I mean, of course, the young generation move on from Khomeini or Shariati. But I remember when I was a teenager, and I was reading Shariati's book. It was forbidden in my village, and I was punished by reading one of the most, big supporter of the revolution. So I was banned. But now, when I just look back and I ask my family, they're still proud of revolution, but they are not proud of me. And so I just wanted to make it clear that the generation of revolution, people like me, they are called by the government of Iran anti-revolution, Zidd Enqilab. And this is the best label that the government gave it to me, anti-revolution, because I got a lot of them, like Ugly Duckling. They don't know the end of the story of Ugly Duckling, so don't expect me to... or servant of the Queen, or paid by CIA, MI6. So anti-revolution is a label that we all get from here. Yes, this generation now use social media as an alternative media. And I always say that we have two Iran. One in the map, which you can see through Iranian state TV, Iranian official media. But the face, which I call it stealthy face, hidden face, you never have the chance to see it through Iranian state TV. It's on social media. If you want to hear the real voice of Iran, it's on social media. When Nina said that she got a lot of comments from brave Iranian young people and commenting on her book, I'm not surprised. Because when I was in Iran, I was brave. But when I left Iran, I just lost my bravery. And I think the new generation are really brave inside Iran. So for you, maybe just sharing a picture of a woman without headscarf, it's just nothing. But for us, that means a lot. That means from the age of 7, we had to hide our own identity and go to public. And when we share our picture on social media, that doesn't mean just we want to feel the wind through our hair, which is really important and enjoyable, but we want to get our own identity back. So I use social media only to make these people to be their own storytellers and to show the rest of the world the hidden face of Iran. Because freedom is freedom and cannot come with any adjective. And when we call it stealthy freedom, that means stealthy freedom, secret freedom, never scared any government. But when you shout it loud and you share it with the rest of the world, that can scare the government. So that's why, for me, social media is just a window to go to Iran and give a platform to the young generation who want to show the hidden face of Iran and want the rest of the world to recognize the hidden face of Iran, the stealthy Iran. And when I started my stealthy freedom, I have to be honest, that was not even a plan. Because my main focus, you can stop me anytime if I talk too much.
Right, please.
That's why I got expelled from MPs, from Iranian parliament, because I talk too much and I'm loud. So when I started my stealthy freedom, it was not a plan. It was, as I said, it was my stealthy freedom. And I just was enjoying the wind through my hair in a nice and beautiful street in London, and saying that every time when I run in a free street and I feel the wind through my hair, it just reminds me of the time when my hair was like a hostage in the hand of the Iranian government. That was all. So my main focus was about human rights and giving voice to those people who lost their loved ones inside Iran after 2009 election. That was my main concern. I was a political journalist, and my main focus was writing about politicians and finding corruption in Iranian politics. That's all. And then when I shared my own experience on social media, I was bombarded by pictures from women inside Iran. So maybe for you it's a small issue, or it's just a piece of cloth. But for the young generation in Iran, it's the first step toward full equality, and it's the first step to get their own identity back. So that's why 1 million followers on social media, they don't want to, to just have the freedom of choice to wear what they want to wear. This is not the only demand. This is just the first step, because from the age of 7, they were not allowed to be their true self. So for me, to just make it easy, social media, it's a tool to just let the new generation to be their true self.
Nancy, let me ask you a two-part follow-up. One thing you will hear from people is that, well, these are just women from the north of Tehran, and they don't represent the country's broader socioeconomic diversity. How do you answer that? And then two is those who say, well, of all the challenges facing Iranian women and civil society, the veil isn't at the top of the list. We need to fight for legal rights and things like that. How do you answer those questions?
Good question. First of all, I am not from north of Iran. I'm from a small village. And through my stealthy freedom, I receive a lot of pictures and experiences from people from small village, small town, and different society. And from the beginning, for me, it was like, okay, we're fighting with the government. But through receiving a lot of comments from Iranian women, I just found out that these women need a platform to debate about the issue in their own society, their own family. So maybe it's, if it would be good if I give you some example. Like, I received a picture from a woman, and a week later, I received a comment from her husband saying that, remove that photo, because I don't want my wife to be in trouble in Iran. So I was not sure what to do. Then I received another comment from her daughter saying that you're causing argument and fight inside my house. Please remove my mother's photo. What should you do if you receive these comments? I did the same. I removed it because I didn't want to, get this family into trouble. And then 1 week later, I received a comment from that lady saying that you are not the voice of Iranian women. You are the voice of my husband and the men. Because I'm not fighting with the government. I'm fighting for my own right through my own family. And you just now let my husband to win the fight. So I received a lot of comments from people from different society, not just north of Iran. They need to have such a debate in their own family and own society. And as I said, yes, I get a lot of comments from especially men saying that this is just a piece of cloth. You know what I do? I carry a headscarf with myself and I go and give it to that man and saying that you have to wear it right now. And if say, don't be rude and I'm talking to you about a serious topic, I will force him to wear it. And I said, you have to understand, how does it feel if you're forced to wear this? And then we have time to talk about so bigger issues. So this is the way, because otherwise they won't understand that. For more than 37 years, we have been forced to be someone else. And then you want us to talk about bigger issues? Of course, we have so many bigger issues in Middle East. But this is important because be honest with me. Every morning, if you want to go out, what do? You care about freedom of speech? Every morning you think, okay, now I want to go out and I have to talk about freedom of religion? You talk about freedom of expression? No, you all care about your appearance. You use mirror to make yourself beautiful or handsome. So let us, first of all, to be our true self. We, the women of Iran, know that this is not the only demand, but we want to be ourselves and we don't want to use the mirror every morning to make ourselves ugly. Freedom of choice is beautiful.
Thank you. So we're going to come back
I have to make it clear, by ugly I don't mean those women who wear hijab, they are not beautiful. But when you're forced to wear hijab, this is ugly. All the female in my family, my mother, my sisters, in fact, all the female in my family, they wear hijab. And I strongly believe that they have to be free what they want to wear. But I want to walk shoulder to shoulder with my mother and my sister inside Iran and have the same freedom as they do. That's just one
important point. Please,
I also agree with Massi. I grew up with two grandmothers that I write about in the book. One of them was a devout woman who wore the headscarf till the day she passed away in California even. So she had the freedom not to wear the headscarf, but she chose to wear the headscarf. And I had my other maternal grandmother who was very liberal. She went to one of the first missionary schools in Iran in the early 1900s. She was so liberal that she swam topless in our pool in Iran in the 1970s. So I grew up with one grandmother who was praying and devout, and the other who was, very much bare and out there. So I, like Massi, agree that every woman, not just in Iran, everywhere, should have a choice, an entire choice. The other interesting phenomenon about Iran and the veil is Khomeini called the veil the flag of the revolution. Fast forward, his granddaughter, Zahra Shahi, recently said, I'm sorry that the veil was ever imposed because it has become a symbol of this regime, which is an oppressive regime. So I'm taking what Khomeini revered and fast forwarding it to his own granddaughter, who's actually not in favor of this oppressive measure.
That's a very important point. And I'm mindful of the fact that there's so many prominent Iranian thinkers and activists in the audience. So I'm actually going to turn it over to all of you soon. So think about your questions. I wanted to acknowledge Najma Batmanglij and her husband, Mohammed. She's Iran's most famous chef, and her and Mohammed have a wonderful publishing house. So I just don't want to embarrass you, but I see you, and we appreciate so much that all that you do. You both mentioned Khomeini, and one of the things I'm very curious about in contemporary Iran is the legacy of Ayatollah Khomeini and the popularity or lack thereof of Khomeini. There was a very interesting article in the New York Times a couple months ago about the resurgence of Stalin in Russia, the popularity and kind of romanticism of Stalin among Russians. When you travel to China these days, you see kind of T-shirts and tchotchkes of Chairman Mao everywhere. These are two people responsible for the deaths of millions, tens of millions of their own citizens. But there seems to be kind of a whitewashing of history or romanticism. And I'm curious, Laura, in your time, the time you spent in Iran, the time you spent over the last decade interviewing Iranians, how would you assess the legacy and the popularity of Ayatollah Khomeini and how people have evolved to think about him over the years?
I think there's a crucial difference between the role of Khomeini in Iran and the role of Stalin in Russia, which is that the Iranian system is still Khomeini's system. So there is not that sense of distance or nostalgia, for better or worse. One of the things that really has struck me over the course of time in reporting on and from Iran and talking to Iranians has been the legacy of the Khomeini era. The 1980s, the period of the revolution, and after were really the first decade, were a really violent and dark time in Iranian history. Both politically, there was the war with Iraq, there was also political violence inside Iran, and a sort of a consolidation of the regime that cost a lot of lives and livelihoods. And I felt very strongly that that sort of sits as a trauma in the consciousness of a lot of Iranians. And it's not really shared very much because there are some red lines around some of these subjects. But it seems to me like somewhere down the line, some kind of reconciliation with that history is going to be a crucial part of moving forward. Because especially for people of Massey's generation, the first post-revolutionary generation, whose childhoods coincided with this kind of frightening period in history. Every single one of them who I interviewed would speak of those years with a certain kind of unresolved sense of trauma. So, I mean, and I mean that maybe that's a term that is that's maybe not so precise, but it's a historical trauma, not in the sense, not everybody has a personal experience of that violence, but everybody had an experience of the ambiance of it. So that's definitely one thing that strikes me for the younger generation, who I don't think has a lot of nostalgia for that period. In terms of Khomeini, the man himself, that one other really interesting moment in the reinterpretation of his legacy was 2009, where you had his sort of favored prime minister, Mir Hossein Mousavi, who was the standard bearer of the Green Movement in 2009, who was really constantly invoking Khomeini in a positive sense. And there was a lot of kind of interesting rhetorical appropriation of that legacy, which could be interpreted as necessary in the environment that existed at that time and with the constraints that existed at that time. It was a way of legitimizing one's position and one's stake, was to sort of say this is actually, it's Khomeini's legacy has been perverted, and we're going to return it to the original, to the greater legacy of this great man. I don't know for how much of the audience for those remarks really believed that, and how much of the audience of those remarks was instrumentalizing that. But just sort of anecdotally, I wanted to sort of address also just very quickly the point that you raised about class and this kind of recurring critique that we hear that, well, not just the women's movement, but the democracy movement, the reform movement, all of this is just the irrelevant posturing of people from the north of Tehran. And as a reporter, I found that to be a sort of maddening refrain, because I think anybody who has spent time in Iran can tell you that this is not the locus of activism. That the people who have really committed their lives to civic activism in Iran, that's a ruinous profession. It's not like you go to be a civic activist for the glory when you're living in a closed society where it can cost you your freedom and really mess with you and your family for the rest of your life. So the people who committed themselves to that, I found, interestingly, many of them came from the lower middle class. And that's partially, I think, it has something to do with demographic changes that have happened since the revolution, and with this sort of rapid urbanization in Iran and the expansion of the middle class. That's one of the achievements of the Islamic Republic, has been to improve the countryside and to bring more rural people into a growing and increasingly urbanized middle class, this is the part of the population that is chafing in many ways against the restrictions of the regime and is creating friction for the Islamic Republic.
It's an important point, which I think is sometimes confusing to outside observers, which is you can be very religious and you can be pious and you can, on those grounds, not be a fan of the Islamic Republic because you see that conflating religion and authoritarian politics can actually repel people away from religion. But just to follow up briefly on the previous question, which is these people you've profiled, women's rights activists, journalists, others, who are the people that they are looking up to? Maybe the answer is nobody, but are there individuals, movements, whether inside the country, outside the country, that they see as potential political leaders, thought leaders, objects of emulation?
I think that varies somewhat. And I structured the book in a way to account for the evolution of these movements, this movement or movements, because in the reform period, so really from like the early 90s through about 2005, you had a movement that was in a sense organized around this internal reformist faction. And those activists had, or believed they had, allies within the political system. And people who were thinkers, or they were politicians, or they were license holders of newspapers, who were their elders and who brought them into this space and who said that the demand on them was to expand civil society and create a more dynamic civic culture. So those activists had a particular experience of being a part of a more sort of knitted together movement. And they experienced a very harsh disillusionment because their elders were not able to protect them when the full force of the judiciary and the security establishment came down on them. And many of them turned on some of those mentors or turned away from them, let's say. The fourth part of my book, which takes place under Ahmadinejad, I chose to center on the women's movement because it seemed in some way to me like this was the kind of activism that survived in this period, and it's very different. I don't see that movement as having ever expected to be knitted into the establishment of the country. It's more oppositional. There are different ways of approaching the fight for women's rights in Iran, and the person I profiled was a anti-stoning activist. But they're all different sort of ways of approaching this, and this was really a movement that was putting pressure on the legal system, the judiciary, and also on law. So I don't, in some ways, I see that as a little bit less of a hierarchical. It's more of a, it's not the same kind of movement as one that sort of sees itself as belonging to a political faction and moving through particular political avenues with visions articulated by of intellectuals.
So it's just listening to your answer, it sounds like there isn't, whereas in the 70s there often was this kind of knight in shining armor that people were looking to, whether that was Shariati or Khomeini. That doesn't seem to be the case today. And it may be by design that people have, in some ways, as you said, they're maybe more pragmatic and not looking for kind of instant fixes.
Well, we'll have to see where these kinds of impulses go under the Rouhani administration. And I think in some ways we've been waiting to see what happens because the nuclear agreement was the first real mandate of the Rouhani administration. And now that the parliament has turned over and you have sort of reform-minded Iranian voters who actually came to the polls and expect to be represented by this parliament and expect to have some kind of a role going forward politically. We'll see what form that takes and whether it's influenced by some of the harsh history that's gone before.
Yeah. Let me ask a pointed question to both of you, which is gender equality possible in an Islamic theocracy? Is it possible to reform the Islamic Republic into a system which respects women's rights? And if the answer to that is yes, how do you see that reform happening? And if the answer is no, then are we at a dead end? You want to start now?
It's not so black and white as yes and no. Women have made some gains within this patriarchal climate, within the discriminatory gender laws they have. The women's rights movement in post-revolutionary Iran is a grassroots movement, and as Laura mentioned, there's no leader. Everyone contributes to different pockets. So these women do work, religious-minded women and secular women do work in sync because they have a common cause that they're working towards. So any way you can make it work, sort of a means to an end, everyone is for that. For example, with the 1 million signature campaign, they were able to make some strides and reverse, partially at least, some of the gender discriminatory laws. For example, these women pressured Parliament into amending the inheritance laws, whereby a woman has the right to inherit her husband's property. Women also, in the Western world, this might not be much of a gain, but it's all one small step at a time. Women were entitled to equal blood money in accidents covered by insurance. Partial amendments right now with the last parliamentary elections. We have more women in the parliament now than clerics. That is unprecedented. When the first parliamentary elections, there were 164 clerics. Now it's dwindled to 16. Outnumbered by women just by 17, but nonetheless shows significant gains for women. We had 9 women in the parliament. During the last parliamentary, it's moved up to 17. So these are incremental changes. The reformist movement did a lot to help the women's rights movement. So within this oppressive patriarchal pocket, it is possible to reverse some or amend some of the gender discriminatory laws. I don't believe it is as black and white as yes and no. I think with the ongoing activism and the resistance and the resilience these women have shown, and they're not about to back down. Women suffer harsh penalties for the slightest deviation, but they still keep going. Look, you're talking about a country where former President Rafsanjani's daughter went to Evin prison for her women's rights activism. So, these women just don't back down, which is a great sign. That being said, we don't have full gender equality really even in this country. So, what I want to put into perspective when I talk about women's rights in Iran is that from a global perspective, Iran has a long way to go within this theocratic regime, but also from a global perspective that this is not just strictly an Iran problem. This is a global epidemic. I mean, you're talking about over 150 countries worldwide have at least one gender discriminatory laws. There are ongoing issues with women worldwide, but within this theocracy, full emancipation is highly unlikely.
Because in America, we call it a glass ceiling. In Iran, it's more of a concrete ceiling, which is much lower.
Right.
But how would you answer that question, Masih?
This is a controversial question. I mean, honestly, as a campaigner, I don't want to go deep on that because I'm a little bit, I'm not optimistic. My tactic is to use all the religious politicians and all the religious people to remove all the religious laws. Yeah. Because from the age of 7 as a woman, I just faced all the religious laws against myself. And I often get asked, but I mean, even here by Western journalists, whether by my activities, whether I'm against Islam. And my clear answer is this: I have nothing to do with Islam. But in Islamic Republic of Iran, this is Islam which is against me from the age of 7. You know, if I want to go to school, I have to wear a headscarf. My brother, no. And if I want to get married, I have to get permission from my father. So you think after getting married you're free? No. If you want to get an education, or if you want to get a passport and travel abroad, you have to get a permission from your husband. the testimony of women. So as you made it clear, but the rest, as a woman, you cannot be a judge. As a woman, you cannot be president. As a woman, you are second-class citizen. So this is all coming from religious laws inside Iran. So that's why I always say that, yeah, like the 1 million signature campaign and the rest of the women activists inside Iran, we need to work with those religious members of Iranian parliament and the women activists inside Iran. But the goal should be to remove all the Islamic laws because, in my opinion, these are against women.
Well, I have so many more questions, but I want you to ask your questions while you're getting your questions ready. Just one quick question I wanted to ask you. We were talking about the legacy of Khomeini and how.
Let's forget about Khomeini and go to new generation.
Well, I'm just curious, when you hear the name Ayatollah Khomeini, I remember being, as a young boy, it was like a cartoon villain for me. I was scared of him. How do you think of Khomeini when you see his picture or you hear his name?
Okay, don't expect me to speak as well as they speak English.
No, you're much
but
better.
I'm gonna tell you a memory of Khomeini in Iran. فقط بگو طویله چی میشه؟ Stable. So my father, as I said, he was big fan of Ayatollah Khomeini. I was just 2 years old. I have nothing to do with the revolution, but I just wanted to make my father happy. So he was a dastfurush. Dastfurush? Street vendor. So he used to, grow up vegetable in our garden, my mother actually, and then he used to go out and sell chicken, dogs. So it was his job. So when in his way back home, all was in my mind to just make him happy. So I started to draw Ayatollah Khomeini's portrait. And I told myself in that age, where is the first place that my father go after getting back home? Was Tabile, stable. So I got the drawing and I put it there to make my father happy. And I was punished because my father just, went to the Tabile and then saw the cows and Ayatollah Khomeini's together and he didn't like it. So my memory is just that. And I was punished from that age and couldn't draw anything from that age. So, but apart from my memory, as Laura said, some of us might not face any, direct torture or direct problem after Khomeini, but we used to see around ourselves that there was one village, after my village, and I used to see a mother moaning in a small grave in her garden. And I was wondering why. So after the mass executions during, the mother was forced to bury her children in her garden. So my memory is this, but as I learned from my own experience and the young generation inside Iran right now, we have to move on from Ayatollah Khomeini. And we have to believe in ourselves. And I'm sure that there are a lot of young people, they want to criticize Ayatollah Khomeini inside Iran, but there is no chance and there is no opportunity for them. That's why they just, as Ayatollah Khamenei said, just recently, learning English is unhealthy. And I have to say that the young generation speaks English very well. And I asked them to respond to Ayatollah Khomeini's comment. And I received like more than 50 audio messages from through Telegram, which is new, and you have to try it. Okay. And it was all in a perfect English. And they study a lot of books, which we never had the chance to read about our own history inside Iran. So and I get to know about, our own history a lot after living Iran. So this is new generation and my memory about Khomeini.
Yeah, thank you for that. So let's take a few questions at once. If you can just be concise and introduce yourself. This is the first hand I saw up here in the front.
Thank you very much. Michael Kurtzig, who's retired from the Department of Agriculture, was the Iranian desk officer in the 1970s and 80s, left Iran in July 1978 after doing some work and said the Shah would not survive 6 months. And I sort of saw things coming very quickly. But I want to ask something a little bit different from the feminine side and so on, maybe not so much. There's a very sharp drop in fertility rate in Iran. And I suspect that's partly because the women have moved to the cities now and become more educated. And how do you see that as a long-term impact on the economy, on the labor force? Yeah, I think that's basically the question.
That's a very good question. Is any in the back? Any questions? Shy audience. There's one.
I know I'm gonna.
Yeah, I'll write it down.
The question is, can't you just look like a man and not sexually harass everyone who sees you? I know it's illegal in Islam to make your appearance a man, but it's also illegal in Islam to take off your headscarf. Do you have to show your legs and arms if men do not?
And I'm not.
So we can take it. The first is about the drop in birth rate in Iran and the impact it's having on its politics, economics. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there was a precipitous drop in the birth rate under the Islamic Republic, and that has certainly been beneficial particularly to rural women. That's where the drop was most clear, and also, as you mentioned, with the increasing urbanization and with the spread of under Rafsanjani, the Islamic Republic established campuses, university campuses all over the country in hard-to-reach areas that previously hadn't had access to higher education. So overall, the effect has actually been a real rise in the educational attainment of women. And that has produced its own pressures. So yet again, here's an area where the Islamic Republic is, in a sense, the victim of its success, if it were to see that as a success. Because now you have, I think we all have heard this statistic that now more than 60% of college-educated people in Iran are women. However, if you look at employment statistics, by far the highest unemployment is among the most educated women. So if you wanted to track that against the rise of the women's rights movement, that might be interesting.
Assi, you're one of how many children? How many brothers and sisters do you have?
5.
5. And what about your generation in the villages? Is the number of children gone down among your siblings?
Yeah, the school that I used to go is just useless now.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you mentioned about women coming to the cities and they're educated, as Laura said. More than 60% of the university places are women inside Iran. But the thing is, I just want to say something about a nuclear deal if I have time. After the Iran deal, I mean, women's rights in Iran hasn't started just recently, and it has a history. But after Iran deal, we keep hearing shh, and they care about the economic situation in Iran, and they want us to keep silent because they want to get Iran deal succeed, which we want to get Iran deal succeed too, and we want to open the door toward the tourism. But the red line first was about Iran deal, and now there is another red line. It's about tourism, and they're saying that because you're talking about human rights abuse inside Iran, so you're creating Iran phobia. So my question is this: I really want to ask the audiences, who is causing Iran phobia? You really think human rights activists or women rights activists inside Iran who talk about human rights abuse causing Iran phobia, or those morality police within a year arrested 3.6 million women just because of not having a proper Islamic hijab? So after 2009 election, more than 100 people got killed and got into prison and tortured to death. I myself interviewed the family of more than 50, protesters who got killed. I just want to ask you, who is causing Iran phobia? The killers or the storytellers? So, and all the time they say that, because we want to get the Iran deal succeed and, open the door, and we want to get the women and the economic situation better, they ask us to keep silence and the fingers in front of us, just shh. But I want to just say that here and use the opportunity and say that we are not against Iran. this is Islamic Republic of Iran, which is against Iran. And when they say, "Hush, do not embarrass your own country," it reminds me of a woman who was in an abusing relationship with her husband. And she was beaten by her husband in daily life. She was blue and black. And she was screaming. She was loud and asking for help. And the family were just, telling her, "Shh, you're embarrassing the family. It's an internal matter. Go and talk to your own family." We keep hearing that. People saying that, "Shh, this is an internal matter. You're embarrassing your own country. Go and talk to your own country, and this is a problem should be solved within the country." This is just remind me of the abusing relationship. More than 30 years, the Iranian laws abusing human rights inside Iran, and we keep hearing now that just because of nuclear deal, do not embarrass Iran and do not put pressure on Iran. We just embarrassing Islamic Republic of Iran, and the point is you have to talk to Iranian government and not just asking human rights to keep silent. Of course, we want nuclear deal to be succeed, but we do not want to bury human rights deal under the nuclear
That's
deal.
a very good point. There's a quote I really like from George Orwell. He says that patriots are proud of their country for what it does, and nationalists are proud of their country no matter what it does. And there's a lot of Iranian nationalists these days, and we need more patriots. Cornelius in the back.
Thank you very much. Cornelius Adebar with the Carnegie Endowment. The last comment inspired me to a question about the role of Western governments, the Europeans, the Americans, especially when it comes to civil society. There is a lot of talk about being, soft on the current government because it's the best one can hope for, supporting Rouhani and Zarif in their endeavors. The same being silent is also made as an argument here. For you as authors and civil society activists, what do you see as the role of governments both in Europe and the United States? How engaged should they get? How much pressure can this current government sustain? What should the Western governments do? Thank you.
That's a great question. Let's actually go to that right now so you don't forget, because I think it's an important topic. Well, you want to start, Marcia?
I myself do not expect anything from Western government except do not keep us silent when we are shouting. And because it just reminds me of the time when people were in the street and shouting, during the demonstration, the peaceful demonstration actually got cracked down by the government of Iran. And people were shouting and saying that Obama, you either with us or with them. Obama, ya ba una, ya ba ma. And Obama was with them. So, and sending a letter to the supreme leader of Iran. So for me, because I always ask the female politicians who travel Iran and who visit the government of Iran, I always want to tell them that we do not ask you to come and save us. Because, as I said, more than 60% of the university places are women. And these women show that they are brave and strong and smart enough to defend themselves. But what I want to point out here and make it clear, when you go Iran and you see that how they manage to raise their voice, don't ignore them and don't keep them silent. We are against compulsory hijab, and now it has like 1 million followers, and women just risk their life and sending their pictures without headscarf, which is a punishable crime inside Iran. But you see, Mogherini goes to Iran without asking a single question about compulsory hijab. There are so many just excuses. One, because hijab is required by law, and Mogherini or other female politicians, they do not want to interfere in any, Iranian internal matter because it's required by law. As I always say that slavery used to be legal. If no one objected against slavery, so nowadays slavery could have been with us. Or they say that this is a cultural issue. They might be kidding me. We're talking about compulsion. So you say compulsion is our culture? My mom, she's not even able to read and write, but she doesn't force me to be like her. This is the culture of Iran. So when I ask female politicians, actually I sent several letters to them. They all ignored me, except one, Marich's Khake. Why? Because she covered her hair not properly and she got not arrested. She got attacked by the politicians inside Iran. And then she mentioned about my stealthy freedom. And she said that I covered myself the way when I saw women were covering themselves in the street. So she never faced the morality police. So she mentioned about our cause. The only thing that I want, when you go and visit Iran, when you see the women and people inside Iran, they manage to raise their voice, do not ignore them. Because the government of Iran can use this and put more pressure on the women. And I want to give you just one example. I interviewed the mother of Sattar Beheshti. Iranian people, they know him. He was a young blogger criticizing the government, and then he was arrested. After 9 days, he got killed. His mother was like my mother, not even able to read and write. But she was brave and smart to raise her voice. She's outspoken, and she started to shout and scream. When Catherine Ashton went to Iran, she couldn't ignore Sattar Beheshti's mother. Why? Because women rights activists and human rights activists, they helped Sattar's mother to be heard. And in that time, no one was saying, shh. Why? Because Ahmadinejad was in power. As a journalist and women rights activist, doesn't matter who is in power. Of course, we welcome Iran deal, and we don't want Iran to be isolated. We don't want Iran to suffer from sanction, but we have to ask any politicians, do not sanction on our own people, whether Western government or Iranian government, who do sanction their own people. So for me, it's important to ask all the Western government, do not ignore Iranian people just because of commercial matter or having, business with Iranian people, which is important for us. But human rights is important for us as well. If you ignore Iranian people, you give Iranian government power to ignore us. And this is the only way that we can empower Iranian people inside Iran. I think I said everything.
Thank you. I pose that to both of you as well, if you have thoughts about how either the US, the Europe, the West can help the cause of civil society and women's rights in Iran.
I think the international community, especially international organizations, can help. I'll give you an example because this question I can go on and on about. For example, Iran was, women are banned from attending all male sports games. Recently, the International Volleyball Federation, which in their bylaws say they're committed to gender equality, allowed Iran a couple of months ago to host an all-male volleyball game on the island of Kish. Well, guess what? Women are not allowed to attend. My whole stance on this is, if you are committed to gender equality, why are you allowing a regime that denigrates women and is not committed to gender equality to host a game where women are not allowed to go? So what the International Volleyball Federation can do, for example, is say, okay, we will allow you to host this game if you allow women. If you don't, sorry, you can't. It's as black and white as this. It's not just one organization. It's like Masih said, different pockets in the Western community at large have to band together and put these kind of nonviolent pressures on the regime, hoping for incremental change.
It's a very good concrete prescription. Laura, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think one thing that I'm sort of hearing from both of my co-panelists is that a lot of the constructive space is in civil society, more even than foreign governments putting pressure on Iran on human rights, because there we have a sort of a politically explosive and possibly counterproductive set of concerns. But within civil society, I think absolutely it makes sense for international NGOs, for the media, for journalists. And I see this listening to Masih. I was thinking about some of the dilemmas that Western journalists face when they go into Iran. And you know that if you do report honestly in some areas, you may risk your access permanently. And those are dilemmas we all face, and I think that Westerners need to be brave about them and need to be willing to say that we're not going to be held, that we're not going to be silenced by the preferences of the Iranian government, and that's about both truth telling and about some of the kinds of initiatives that Nina mentions.
Yeah, I mean, I was amazed that Laura over the years has written many beautiful profiles in the New Yorker, in which she didn't pull punches, and I'm amazed you always were able to go back and come back with those tough stories, and they'd let you back. So I take my hat off to you. We have about 5-7 minutes left, so I want to take two final questions. There was one I see in the back there.
Hi, Nazanin Suresh with IHS. My question is directed at the panel. What sort of processes or capabilities are at your disposal or at the civil society of Iran's disposal to bring about the sort of changes that we're talking about here? The reform movement, as we have discussed, they pushed, and obviously there's no denial that there is an active civil society within Iran and there is a desire for change. But we haven't seen that reflected within the political processes, within the political establishment. And when we saw a push, we saw them being marginalized. It doesn't appear to me that the Iranian civil society is prepared to go into the streets or bear the sort of the blood that sometimes comes or expected with the sort of movements. And the political processes, even the latest round of the parliamentary elections, we saw that the reformists were talking about economic sort of access and reforms rather than political ones. The narrative was changed from 2009 and was a lot more aligned with allowing Rouhani to be, the better of the horrible options that were sort of, on the table. So given those sort of options, how do you see these activism translating into sort of results in Iran?
Great question, Nazanin. Thank you. Any final questions? Way in the back. I believe Anthony Vance.
Thank you. Anthony Vance, Office of Public Affairs for the Baha'is of the United States. It seems almost inevitable that there will be a great deal of new business investment into Iran coming from the West. What would you think about the possibility of placing or encouraging Western businesses to adopt fair employment practices that compelled them to treat fairly women and minorities within Iran? Do you think that's a realistic possibility, or do you think it's just a paper exercise? Do you think there's any space within the economic and political reality of Iran for something like that to have some kind of impact?
Thank you, Anthony. So let me start with you, Laura. Any answers to those questions and any final thoughts?
The first question was a really acute sort of summation of the political moment we've arrived at now, and these are the big questions and the sort of fault lines among people sort of watching Iranian politics today. There's, on the one hand, I think we have to be honest about what happened in 2009. The reform movement, as it once existed, was thrust into a legal no man's land. There are still reformist politicians and thinkers and activists in prison, and there are still places where one cannot go in public life in Iran. This entire movement that had been a part of the establishment was now termed the sedition, which is a clear indication of how far outside the realm of the possible it sat. Now, with Rouhani, we see something that looks more hopeful, where we have both candidates from the reformist end of the spectrum and Rouhani himself embracing the reformist electorate. And there is some hope that now these people who had been excluded from political public life for the final 4 years of Ahmadinejad's term are coming back into the system and are buying into the system, and therefore they have some right and some reason to expect it to be responsive to their demands. The question is, to what extent, and what it means that this, in a sense, you can look at President Rouhani as really a figure from the pragmatic center of the Iranian political spectrum, once known as the center-right, and he is his faction essentially relies on coalition building. This is not a faction with its own constituency in a sense, although it has some. But in order to survive in power, it needs to pull in moderate conservatives and moderate reformists and hold them in an alliance. To do that, how many of the sort of the demands of civil society can actually be addressed and met, and how many of them then become sort of a drag on Rouhani, who needs to maintain his viability. So I don't have an answer to that question, because honestly, by day, you don't ever want to be pessimistic about Iran, because the civil society is so dynamic, and there are so many people who have staked their lives on the project of creating a better country. And it's almost impossible to meet those people and talk to those people and not feel optimistic for the future. On the other hand, the political system has not shown a great deal of responsiveness, and I think that we have to be honest about that. So I don't know what the future holds. When I talk to people who are optimistic, they say, well, you know, the original reform movement it pushed too hard, too fast, and we're talking about really slow-going incremental change at this point. And we're much savvier than we used to be, and we're going to use the spaces that we have. And if we use them right, without provoking a crackdown, we can eventually build some better things into this system. My sense is that honestly, that was actually the agenda of the reform movement to begin with. So to what extent this is different, I don't know. There is one thing that is different is the history that's behind the Islamic Republic, and the rupture that 2009 caused. We don't know psychologically where that has left the leader, and to what extent it has, you know, it's become a place of no return that would lead the regime to be more flexible. On the other hand, maybe he considers it a success, and now the regime has been strengthened and consolidated toward its center, and we know where the boundaries lie. I'm going to give you 6 of one, half dozen of the other.
That's always the smart option, not to make predictions about Iran. Nina?
The way I see the Islamic Republic, the problems are multifaceted, but one of the main problems with Iran moving forward and building on the gains of the best case scenario post-revolutionary Iran, which was the reformist movement, is the fact that there's a hardline supreme leader, and that is there. That is something that is always going to be an obstacle in terms of what Laura described and moving forward. And for civil society, you have a highly educated, not just female population, but you have a young, Iran is, I think, over 70 million, and a very young population.
Close to 80 million.
Close to 80 million, most of them are under the age of 35. One of Iran's biggest wasted resources is its highly educated population. Approximately over 160,000 Iranians leave Iran every year annually because of bleak economic prospects. This tug of war that exists under the banner of the Islamic Republic is a continuous obstacle. Look, they put a ban on Khatami, his image and his words, really the icon of the reformist movement. You still have Mir Hossein Mousavi and Karoubi, who are under house arrest. The other big obstacle for Iran, as I always say this, is who is the knight in shining armor? Who do this young generation have to look to for salvation? So it's almost like you pick evil or lesser of all evil. But the problem with Iran, unfortunately, is, let's just say the people decide they're going to go through another bloody revolution. But who is standing on the sidelines waiting to rescue Iran? That is the big question. That is the sad question.
Yeah, no, it's well put. Masih, you have the final words. 3 minutes. You can say whatever you want to.
So yeah, I lost everything. I lost my family. I left my family in Iran. I lost my books, my house, my home, everything, but not hope. And that scares the government of Iran. And that's why I strongly believe that change will not come except through Iranian women. If I force any of men here any of you, to wear headscarf and go to school, you won't get more than 60% of university. This is women power. And you have to believe in women power in Iran. Otherwise, the change will not come. This is not just a slogan or this is just a nice statement. I strongly believe that the loudest voice you can hear against human rights abuse is through mothers inside Iran. So I ask all the female politicians to be as brave as Iranian women inside Iran. That is the only way that change comes through civil society inside Iran.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.